What's up, Rocket City?
Hey, Rocket City Church.
Rocket City.
Rocket City Church. Rocket City Church.
Rocket City Church. We just wanted to give you a video to say congratulations.
We are proud of you guys. May God be mighty over you and over your church. This is awesome.
That's right. And we have actually some friends that want to say congratulations. So 12 Stone, here we go. 1, 2, 3.
Congratulations! Congratulations! All right. Love you guys. Praying for you.
Well done. We're excited about what God's going to do in Huntsville. We love being a part of your church. Go Rocket City.
Oh, man, that was so awesome. We love you guys.
Well, that was incredible, wasn't it? I don't know about you. You may be new. You may be joining us online. Thank you for joining us online. You may be here in person, and you may be brand new. Well, that was 12 Stone Church in Atlanta, northeast suburbs of Atlanta. They have multiple campuses, almost 20,000 people at their church, and they are one of our mother churches. And they just decided way back over a year and a half ago to get behind us and believe in us and pray for us and support us. And they shot that video at all their campuses on our launch Sunday on January 24th. And here's what that showed me as I teared up this week watching that for the first time. That showed me that the church can't just be about us. Like they could just keep doing their thing. They would never have to support us. They would never have to be behind us in a tangible way. But they chose to because they knew that God wanted to do more through them than just for them, right? And so we want to live that reality out here at Rocket City Church. We believe that God wants to do more through us than just to us and for us. And so even though we're only 4 weeks old, 4 Sundays old, we've already partnered with a brand new church plant down in Oxford, Talladega area called the Foundry Oxford. And so if you would be praying for Pastor Paul as they get ready to kick off in September, October time frame of this year, we believe that more lives are changed, more new people in a community find hope and find community through a brand new life-giving church. Amen? And so we believe from the very beginning we want church not just to be about us, but about what God wants to do in and through us to help others know and follow Jesus. That's our mission statement, to help people know and follow Jesus. Well, in case you don't know, it is Valentine's Day. And so there's still time for you guys. If you need a little more time, you've got a few hours yet to do something special for that special someone. You know, this week, it was Valentine's party time at the elementary schools here in town. And so I got to show you a picture of my 5th grade daughter, Lily. So this is Lily, and she was totally ready for her party on Thursday in her class. And we said, Lily, are you excited? She goes, yeah, I guess. She goes, but everybody has a Valentine except for me. And I said, oh, man, I'll be your Valentine, right? I'll be your Huckleberry. I'll be whatever you want me to be, right? Like, you're the cutest thing ever. And we said, well, Lily, what does that mean? And she goes, well, it means you're dating. And, well, what does dating mean in 5th grade? And, well, apparently it means that at recess, you walk around the track together. So, where's my wife? Shannon, I have an idea for this afternoon for us for a date. We're going to go to the elementary school, and we're going to walk the track together, okay? So if you're looking for ideas, guys, maybe you could steal that one. Well, we're currently in a teaching series, and we're in week 3, and we're calling it Meals with Jesus. So if you're fresh with us, if you're just joining us today, whether you're watching and joining us from home or here in person, we are in the middle of a teaching series called Meals with Jesus, and we're looking at different meals that people had with Jesus and what that tells us about the heart of God. Because Jesus came, his mission was to serve and not be served, but to also reveal the heart of God. And so if you've seen Jesus, you've seen God, and you've seen his heart. And so his interactions with people over meals tell us a lot about who God is. So here's a question that I have for us right off the top is have you ever opened your mail and received a bill that you could not pay? That you're like, I don't know how I'm going to pay that bill, but somehow we'll figure it out. Maybe, I hope. I don't know how it's going to happen. Anybody ever open that envelope after checking the mail? Anybody? You can raise your hand at home too if you're at home. Well, great. The rest of you are filthy rich. I need to talk to you about some fundraising ideas I have, okay? Well, if you raise your hand and you're like me, 13 and a half, 14 years ago, we received one of those letters, and it was from the hospital right after our firstborn child, Hallie, was born. And I looked at my wife, and she looked at me, and she goes, well, we're not taking her back. And so I said, well, we got to figure this thing out. So we tag team. We set up a time. We go to the hospital. We sit down with a finance lady in the finance department, and we said, look, I do have 2 kidneys. I could sell one maybe, but I really like both of them. And so is there any other way that we could figure this thing out? And so she looked around on her computer screen, hit a keystroke on her keyboard, and within 5 minutes, our bill, massive bill, had been cut in half. And she's like, would that work? And before she changed her mind, I said, yes, it would work. We'll see you. And we set up a plan, and we left out of there. And as we got in the car, I looked at my wife, and I said, hey, you need to go ahead and call our mortgage company and set up an appointment with them. And because if it's that easy, like maybe this would work on our house as well. I don't know, but it's worth a shot. Well, I don't know if you've ever been extended grace like that. But man, that was special. And maybe for you it wasn't a tangible bill. Maybe it was an argument that you got into with somebody, and it really was probably more your fault than their fault, but they forgave you and restored the relationship anyway, and so you were kind of extended grace in that way. A couple weekends ago, our youth pastor and worship pastor, Andy, was traveling back to his home state of Missouri, and he was on the phone with me. And it was a Sunday afternoon, and we were talking about the service and how God showed up and how God moved. And all of a sudden, he goes, hey, I got to go. And so I'm like, all right. Well, so he hung up on me, and then he didn't call me back. I'm like, oh, no, like something happened, right? And he later told me the story. He said he looked up, and he saw the blue and red lights in his rearview mirror, and he thought it was the car behind him, and they pulled over, and then the lights kept coming. And so he pulled over, and the officer walks up and says, sir, do you know what you're doing? He goes, honestly, officer, I do not know what I was doing. He goes, well, what were you doing? And he said, well, I was on the phone with my pastor. To which I think that was just a creative idea on his part, right? And so he got his license registration. He came back, and he gave him a ticket, but it was not a speeding ticket. It was a what? It was a warning ticket. Now, I think it probably said, don't talk to your pastor when you're driving your truck. But either way, there was no monetary payment needed with the warning ticket. So maybe there's an idea next time you get pulled over. I don't know. But what is grace? Grace is simply defined as unmerited favor. It's getting the warning ticket when you actually were going 16 over, not that he was going 16 over, and when you were going over the speed limit and you deserved an actual speeding ticket. You broke the law, but instead you got that which you did not deserve. That is grace. And we all need grace, and here's why. Paul tells us in Romans chapter 3, he says, for all have sinned and are in need of the glory of God. How many of you would say you've messed up at some point in your life? All right, great. Most of you have, and some of you just did because you're lying because you did not raise your hand. All right? Even if you're at home, you can raise your hand. But we've all messed up, and whether that's something small and insignificant as my 6-year-old son this week, that as I was putting him to bed, I said, Titus, did you brush your teeth and did you floss? And he said, yes, I brushed my teeth. And I said, well, did you floss? And he kind of looked up and to the left. And so So I'm like, oh, this probably didn't happen. And he doesn't know the trick yet of just running the toothbrush under the water. And so I decided to go in the bathroom, and I felt of his bristles on his toothbrush. And of course, they were dry as a bone, okay? And to which he did neither brush nor did he floss this week after he clearly and blatantly told me that he did. So we sat down and we had a nice discussion about being honest with mom and dad. Look, when we mess up, even if it's a lie about brushing our teeth or if it's something much more significant, the Bible calls that sin. And it's where we break the heart of God. It happens from the time we are incredibly little, and it continues to happen as we get older. And the only way around that is through Christ. He's the only one that allows us to make up for, or atone is the fancy word, for that sin, and it's through Jesus. I want to show you a picture, and this is a famous painting called the what? The Last what? The Last Supper, painted by Leonardo. It's his depiction of what he thought the Last Supper would have looked like the night before Jesus was crucified, and he shared a meal with his followers. But to fully understand this meal, we have to go back a good ways. And so if you look at Luke 22, verse 1, in verse 1 of this same chapter, Luke, the physician, he starts off by writing, and he says at the very beginning of chapter 1, or chapter 22, he says, as the celebration of the Passover approached. Now our story for today is going to pick up in verse 14, but it frames at the beginning of the chapter with discussion about the Passover. Now, look at verse 14. When Jesus arrived at the upper room, he took his place at the table along with all the disciples. Then he told them, I long with passion and desire to eat this Passover lamb with you before I endure my sufferings. I promise you that next time we eat this, we will be together in the banquet of God's kingdom realm. And then he raised a cup and he gave thanks to God and said to them, take this and pass it on to one another and drink. I promise you that the next time we drink this wine, we will be together in the feast of God's kingdom realm. Then he lifted a loaf, and after praying a prayer of thanksgiving to God, he gave each of his apostles a piece of bread, saying, this loaf is my body, which is now being offered to you. Always eat it to remember me. After supper was over, he lifted the cup again and said, cup is my blood of the new covenant I make with you, and it will be poured out soon for all of you. As I mentioned in verse 1 of this same chapter, the Passover was approaching. And what does that mean in Jewish history? Well, in the 13th century BC, in world history, you can look it up, there was a bunch of people called the Israelite people or the Hebrew people, and they were actually enslaved in Egypt. And so the Pharaoh would use them for slave labor, and they were enslaved for 400 years. And finally, God said, that's enough. I want them to go free. And so he raises up a spokesperson for himself, for his people, to speak for himself to his people, called Moses. And Moses goes to Pharaoh and he says, hey, God wanted me to tell you that you have to let his people go. You have to let them go free. And Pharaoh said, no, not going to happen. I really like having slave labor. They're free. I'm going to keep them. And so plagues began as consequences for disobeying God's order. And they started small, but then they increased in severity as the plagues went on. And finally, the 10th and final plague before Pharaoh said, go, you're free, was the final most severe plague, was the death of the firstborn children in Egypt. And the angel of death would come that evening, Moses said, if the people weren't freed. And Pharaoh said, no, I'm not freeing them. And so as a way out, as a way to avoid this reality, God gave the Israelite people a way to avoid this plague. And it was, they had to go and they had to grab a lamb and they had to kill the lamb and take the blood and put it over the doorpost of their house. And if so, the angel of death would pass over their home and their firstborn child would live. And that's what happened. And it became known as the Passover. And so it became a famous celebration and a moment to remember in the nation, in the history of the Israelite people. And this was the season that Jesus sat down at a Passover meal. This is the season he found himself in with his disciples. And they sat down and they began to have a meal together at the Passover time. And this was a huge deal because you see, every year they had a day in the Hebrew culture, in the Jewish tradition, they had a day called the Day of Atonement, and they would have to bring an animal, a lamb, to the temple, and it would be killed to atone or make up for all of their mess-ups, all of their sins throughout the year. And then in John chapter 1, John the Baptist, right as Jesus was starting his public ministry, he cries out and he shouts before he baptizes Jesus. And he says, "Look, there he is, God's Lamb. He will take away the sins of the world." Jesus became the final lamb, the final sacrifice needed for all of our mess-ups, for all of our sin debt. So when Luke talks about how the Passover was quickly approaching, every Jewish person would have understood the gravity and the meaning behind that and how God provided for them. And think about the foreshadowing here that Jesus, the final perfect lamb, is sitting right in front of them. Once and for all, he is going to be sacrificed the very next day to make up for the sins of the entire world. I mean, this is a big deal. This is a meal unlike any other meal ever. And we've been talking about Passover and meal and the Last Supper, and the underlying theme through this entire dinner, the underlying theme was grace. It was grace. And so I wonder what this grace does mean to you if you've already accepted it freely from Jesus, or if you haven't accepted it, then maybe today's your day. Maybe today is your day to quietly, right where you're sitting, right where you're worshiping at home. Maybe today's going to be the day that you quietly bow your heart and you bow your head and you say, God, I want to accept this grace that you offer through your sacrifice on the cross for my life. I want to give my heart over to you. I freely accept your free gift of grace. And maybe that's a prayer that you pray. If so, we have wooden rockets. If you're in the room, we have wooden rockets out in the lobby. And you're like, what are these little wooden rockets that get attached to this board? Well, you can sign your name and date and say, today was the day that I lifted off my relationship with Jesus. And I started it afresh and anew. And I accepted the grace that only Jesus offers. You know, receiving that grace, that's pretty easy. We all like to receive the drastically reduced debt, the warning ticket. Like, all of that's pretty easy. But when it comes to actually having to give grace, man, that's more of a challenge, isn't it? I mean, that's harder to do. I don't know who you have for your insurance company for your cars, but for several years, my wife and I had Allstate. And at the time, I don't know if they still do now, but at the time, they had a clause called accident what? You've heard of it. You've seen the commercial maybe. Accident forgiveness. And accident forgiveness, it literally read in our insurance clause, it read like this: you strive for safety in navigating the roads, but sometimes accidents happen. We understand that everyone slips up from time to time, which is why we offer accident forgiveness. Accident forgiveness can help you keep your rates from going up even if the incident was your fault. Not too bad, huh? You mess up, and the insurance company, instead of raising your rates, they say, look, everybody gets a one-off, not your fault. Look, we're just going to go ahead and forgive that one and not worry about it. Man, that's easy to accept that. It's more of a challenge to give that. On June 17th of 2015, in Charleston, South Carolina, a group of ladies were gathered in their church for a Wednesday night Bible study. And a guy entered, sat through the whole Bible study, and at the end of it, began to take the lives of the ladies that were there. And it was a horrific tragedy in our nation's history. And there was a lady, a 70-year-old grandmother there named Ethel Lance. And Ethel died that night at the end of her Bible study at the hands of someone that was obviously broken. And her daughter, shortly after the horrific tragedy happened, her daughter, Nadine Collier, who is pictured here, came out with a statement. And Nadine said this: "I will never be able to hold her again, but I forgive you and have mercy on your soul. It hurts me. It hurts a lot of people, but God forgives you, and I forgive you." You know, I can't imagine what it took for her to say that. I can't imagine what it took for Jesus at the Last Supper, at this final meal, that he sits down with all of his followers and he looks across the table and he sees people that will betray him and leave him and forsake him in just a few short hours. And he extends grace to them anyway. He says he longs to be with them, is what we read earlier. I mean, this is who God is. This is who Jesus is, that he extends accident forgiveness on our behalf even before we screw up, even before we mess up. And when we in turn extend that same grace and that same forgiveness as a Jesus follower, when we turn around and do the same that has been done to us through Christ, in that way we create a legacy. In that way we join the Jesus movement. We join a long list of 2,000 years worth of folks that say, I want to be like Jesus. I want to not only receive his grace, but I want to give his grace and I want to extend it. And in that moment, we create a legacy for Ethel Lance. And we say, look, your death wasn't in vain, but because your death happened, your daughter was able to forgive. And because of that, through Jesus, then maybe, just maybe, I can forgive the boss that wrongly terminated my employment. I can forgive the family member that hurt me deeply. I can forgive the friend that talked about me negatively. I can forgive the business partner that cheated me. I can forgive one who abused me. I can do it not because of my own self-will, but through Christ, because of the grace that he's extended to me. You see, in that moment, we choose grace over grudge. Now, grudge is easy. That just comes naturally to our sin nature. But grace, I mean, that's a whole different story. That's harder. That's only through Jesus can that happen, because we first experienced it. Ephesians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul says, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other just as in Christ God forgave you." A couple of thoughts on forgiveness and grace. They're like hand in glove. They go together. Is that forgiveness and grace, they don't lower the standard. They keep the standard right where God intended. Because that's the standard that Jesus set. That's what he set for us. Forgiveness and grace, they don't pretend that the wrong doesn't exist. You know, sometimes we think, well, if I really forgive somebody or if I really extend grace to somebody, then that must mean I just have to act like it never happened, and that's just not the case. You see, we're not about sweeping the wrong under the rug, but we're about acknowledging the wrong and saying, you know what, this happened and I get it and I understand it and I own it if it was me, or I acknowledge it if it happened to me. But then I'm going to extend grace anyway. I'm going to forgive anyway, not in my own power, but because of who Jesus is and who he was. Forgiveness and grace don't erase the consequences. They don't make the ripple effects go away or make them any easier. And so because of that, maybe, just maybe, we might have to set some new boundaries as a result of what happened. Dr. Dan Ryland, pastor, author, says forgiveness is giving the grace God gave you to other people. Imagine for a moment the grace that Jesus is extending. If you look at the picture that Leonardo painted, here sits Jesus. And that wasn't exactly how it happened. We know in Jewish culture they would have been sitting on the ground, kind of reclining at the table with their left elbow on the table and their right arm free. So it's not a perfect depiction, but it's his creative depiction. And imagine looking across the table and seeing Judas and knowing that Judas is going to be Judas and he's going to betray him here in just a short while. And Peter's going to deny him 3 times. And most of the rest of the disciples, well, they're going to be cowardly and they're going to hide and they're not going to have courage. They're going to be weak. They're going to be fearful. After following him for 3 years, Jesus will be lonely on the cross. And yet, Jesus invited them to dine at his table of grace. You know, we're going to take communion here in just a moment. If you're in the room, that's why we provided the cup of juice and the little wafer on top. If you didn't get one of those or one of these cups when you came in, if you'll just raise your hand, we have some people that'll bring one to you if you need one. If you're home and you're joining us online, see if you can find a cracker, a wafer, a cup of coffee, maybe it's a Krispy Kreme donut. I don't know what you have sitting on your counter, but grab whatever you've got to partake in this rich tradition of the church here in just a moment. You know, every year, except for last month, for almost the last 15 years, my dad and I put on a men's retreat. And it's one of those men's retreats that mixes Jesus with being off the grid for a week and getting really muddy and eating some really crazy food. And for some reason, it grows every year and guys love it. And a couple of years ago, it seemingly like rained every single day. And I had, at the time, a 6-month-old brand new truck. And as I drove back home, I realized that when I got home, my truck was probably the dirtiest any vehicle that I had ever had was. And here's what it looked like. You literally couldn't read any emblem hardly on the truck. I mean, it was caked in mud everywhere. And so I do what I do, and it's wintertime, it's cold, I don't want to get out there and have to wash it. And so you take it to a what? A car wash. You guys said it. You take it to a car wash, and so I pull it to the car wash. The couple of guys that are at the beginning, you know, that you pay for the wash, and you pull them through, and they have the long brooms that are like scrubbing and they kind of like their eyes get really big. And so they let me on through, and then my truck slowly starts going through the wash, and all of a sudden I walk around the corner to go inside, and I see this guy like running out to the guys. And obviously he's too late, and come to find out this guy's the owner of the car wash. And he goes out there and kind of gives them a tongue lashing and says, look, you don't let a truck like that through our car wash. And then he comes over to me and he goes, hey, is this your truck? And I said, yeah. Maybe I should have said no on this one, right? And he goes, well, look, man, he goes, if your truck is that dirty, you can't bring it through this car wash again. And he went into this long diatribe about how it was just too dirty and I couldn't bring it through there like that. And to which I'm kind of scratching my head going, well, I thought this was a car wash, right? And it's dirty. And yeah, but it's too dirty. And so I learned something that day. One is that there is a scale of dirtiness when it comes to car washes. And if you're way over here on super dirty mud truck, been in the woods all week, like that's just too dirty, right? Just kind of like dirty down here, that's fine. And for some reason, and it happens in my own life, and I know it happens in your life, is that sometimes we think we're just too dirty to actually go to the car wash that God has provided in the form of His church, in the form of the grace that Jesus freely gives. And it says, look, I don't care how dirty you get in your soul and in your life, like my car wash, my grace will wash over you and make you completely clean, like you've never been clean. But for some reason, we kind of think, well, if I'm just a little dirty and I've just messed up a little bit, like I'm still cool to be in community and be a part of a church and like talk to God. But man, if I'm really like super dirty, I've done some pretty bad stuff, I've really messed up this week or this year or this decade, God can't handle that. God says no. God says, I already know about your dirtiness, and there's this thing that I offer called grace, and it's the ultimate accident forgiveness. You have a debt that you can't pay, and guess what? Grace pays that bill. But for some of you, it's just you need to receive that grace today. I'm going to ask you to stand with us in the room. If you're joining from home, go ahead and stand as well. We're going to worship in this final song. And as we do, I want to give you two challenges. If you're joining us today and you've never freely accepted that gift of grace from Christ, then what if today could be your day? What if today could be your day that you say, you know what, God, finally, I get it. I realize that my soul this whole time has been longing for you and the grace that you give, and you see me and you know what I've done, what I'm going to do, and you still extend grace anyway. You still want to sit at a table with me anyway and dine with me and be friends with me and love me and die for me. And so I want to receive that today. And maybe that's the prayer that you pray. Maybe you're like me and you've been following Jesus for a while, but you've been disconnected from church or community or faith or other believers. You've just been busy and life has gotten in the way. And today, for the first time, you begin to realize, you know what, I needed this. Man, I needed this. I needed to come together. I needed to worship with other believers. I needed to talk to God, get some things squared away. I need to receive His grace yet again in my life. You know, it's not a one-time thing, but God can continue to take us and say, all right, let's go back through the car wash. I love you. I'm not going anywhere. Take some time as you worship. Talk to God.